I'm going to show you in this video how big and booming the street vendor scene has become in Los Angeles. And you'll notice how it seems like we've entered a different country as we drive through them. Also, you'll notice that some of these are operating within or right next to homeless encampments. And while the street vendors seem to be doing a booming business, many of the retail stores behind them are permanently closed after the lockdowns. The first one that we come to is the Los Angeles City College Swap Meet. It's held in the parking lot of the LACC on the corner of Vermont and Monroe Street, and that's at 855 North Vermont. In the parking lot, it's like a very organized affair. Vendors pay a fee to sell, and the shoppers also pay a small fee to enter and shop for bargains. You can see how large it is, with all the tents and the booths going way back into the parking lot, and also on the sidewalk in front of it. But what you're going to notice here is that the vendors spread for several blocks up and down Vermont Street from the parking lot, and I suspect these are unofficial vendors. People are selling out of the back of their cars, from tables, even just laying their merchandise out on the sidewalk. During the lockdowns, it really struck me as an irony to see how many of the vendors were out selling from the streets in front of the brick and mortar stores that were closed and couldn't open for business. Vermont Street was packed with vendors during this time. The large area in the parking lot was closed, but the vendors were operating along the sidewalks. During the lockdowns, it struck me as an irony to see how many of the vendors were selling from the streets in front of the retail stores that couldn't open for business. Vermont Street was packed with vendors. The large area in the parking lot was closed, but the vendors were operating along the sidewalks. When I first noticed this, I stopped to photograph it from across the street. This upset the vendors, and they sent somebody over to tell me to stop. I think they were afraid that I was out to bust them, and that was the last thing on my mind. I was happy to see that people had figured out a way to earn a living during a time when it had basically been made illegal to work. You can see how far they stretch out. Right now the vendors are all the way up to Santa Monica Boulevard. This next one here is in Westlake on Alvarado Street across from MacArthur Park. The merchants have been selling here for as long as I can remember. The only area about this that appears to be formal at all is right around the metro stop. Otherwise, it appears the vendors operate on a wherever you can find to put out your stuff basis. Again, during the lockdowns, the brick and mortar stores were all closed. But the sidewalk was booming. Government approved or not, businesses do have to make a living. And even now, the street vendors are stealing center stage from the retail stores and the strip malls that they're operating in front of. Another thing I found very interesting is that I was down here several times during the lockdowns. And unlike the other parts of town where the streets were deserted, the streets in this area were packed. They were just packed with people. I have footage I shot of the same street during the lockdown, and the crowds on the streets were only slightly smaller than they are in this video. The Westlake area is the most densely populated area in Los Angeles, with people living crowded together in small rooms and tiny apartments. Yet per statistics provided by the LA County Public Health Department, the number of coronavirus cases and deaths in this area wasn't really any higher than the city as a whole. And in fact, it was considerably lower than in some of the areas. Another thing that's really unique about the street market is that it's directly across from a large homeless encampment. And some of the vendors are actually working from within the homeless encampment. When I turn around and drive the other way, you'll see all the homeless tents and the vendor stands in MacArthur Park. MacArthur Park has had a checkered past, but it had been cleaned up in recent years and it was looking fairly good at the close of 2019. Then during the lockdown, unfortunately, it became completely overtaken again by homeless people. And at one point, it was far worse than it is now. And you can see the restrooms they put out for the homeless, and then right next to it, here's a vendor kiosk set up on the sidewalk right out in front of the tents. As we move south, the density of the tents increases, and we see more vendors. Once we passed the park, notice how many retail shops are boarded up. These were the businesses that weren't able to survive during the long lockdowns. I feel that the largest casualty of the pandemic were all of the small businesses that lost everything they had worked for years to build. And yet this aspect of it has received almost no attention in the media. Now we're on Olympic, driving through the fashion district. Here the stores put displays out on the streets, but there are also plenty of vendors setting up makeshift booths and displays on the sidewalks in front of the stores too. During the lockdowns, the fashion district did close down for the most part, although it was very common during lockdown to see merchants that had set up tables in front of their stores and they were selling face masks, sanitizer, whatever else they could to try and make ends meet. There were also a lot of people selling merchandise out of the backs of their cars during the lockdown. Now that LA is mostly reopened, this area is booming. I think the fashion district bounced back faster and stronger than most due to the great bargains that you can get. But the biggest draw might be the street vendors. You'll notice again how many of the shops have steel doors pulled down and for lease signs on them. A very high percentage of the businesses here weren't able to reopen after the long lockdowns. It's very sad to drive around here and see how many businesses are shut down and won't be coming back. Like the street market in Westlake, this one also sits on the edge of a massive homeless encampment. You can see in the next clip here what happens if I go just a block north of Olympic on any of the cross streets. It's right on the boundary of Skid Row. Also on Olympic, but beyond the fashion district, way down between Alameda and Central Streets, we run into another bustling street market. Anything you can imagine is being sold here, and there are a lot of places to eat. And again, we see how many of the businesses failed to reopen after the lockdowns. This market also has Skid Row as its northern neighbor. Before I turn around and show you the other side of Olympic here, I'll show you the tents just a block north. This is the southern boundary of Skid Row. It's a district where thousands of Angelenos are living on the streets. Watch our video on Skid Row to see just how huge this homeless encampment is. I'll link to it in the text below. On the south side of the street here, it's mainly food vendors and outdoor restaurants. You can see how close they are to the street. If I was sitting in the passenger seat of my car, I could reach out and touch the tables as we drive by. The street markets are huge, and there's a lot more of them than I've shown here. When you're in one of them, you'll feel like you're in a different country. So I've seen the street markets expand over 2020. I can't help but feel that we're kind of going the wrong direction. one in which a rapidly growing segment of the population is being forced below the poverty line, and that's not good. But I wouldn't call street markets a bad thing either. These are good, honest people working hard to make a living. It's a fun, festive atmosphere in most of them. Yes, there's horrible traffic, massive crowds, scarce parking, and plenty of homeless people. But you'll also find some great bargains and some wonderful people down here. And who doesn't like to find a bargain? And who doesn't enjoy meeting somebody new?